I think everybody's had an uncle that had like cool stories that were kind of hard to verify about how they like played in the minor leagues and once hit a home run off of Nolan Ryan or once met Hulk Hogan. But I have an uncle that had a really cool story about how he was the police officer that captured Lee Harvey Oswald. And there's receipts. So my Uncle Nick, he's no longer with us, but we were not particularly close on the family tree. He was my grandmother's sister's husband, and he lived up in Arkansas, and I lived in a small town kind of in the Dallas area, and but I did see a lot of him, and we were always pretty close. And I think the main thing was he was kind of this larger than life character, which I think is kind of code word for he was overweight, but kind of looked like W.C. Fields, and he was like this retired kind of bald chubby guy, and he had this real thick Arkansas accent. But his thing is he took a real interest in like the kids in the family. Like he would talk to you like you were an adult. So I'm like a little kid, and he would walk up and would be like, "All right, look me in the eye, shake my hand. You want to make sure they know you mean business. You make eye contact." And he would ask me things like, "How you doing in school? How are your grades? Are you gonna play football like your brother Bobby?" And I really liked that kind of attention because honestly, that generation, the way they dealt with kids was kind of like when they got together with other adults, they sent you off to go play with other kids, and then the adults would all go, drink coffee and complain about taxes and smoke cigarettes or whatever. But he was probably one of the first adults that treated me like I was another adult, and so I always really looked forward to seeing him, and I really liked him. And over time, I learned that he was a retired police officer, which kind of makes sense because the way he talked to me was kind of like a cop would talk to neighborhood kids, like, "Oh, you staying in school?" and stuff like that. So that made sense. And it really stood out that he was a Dallas police officer because one of the things that sticks out from watching King of the Hill is there was an episode where they traveled to Dallas. And as soon as Hank and Peggy cross Dallas city limits, they reach over and hit the lock button on the car door, which my family absolutely did that exact thing. Dallas was like everything great and horrible about the big city. It was like the biggest city in the world to us. And we didn't go there often, but we probably make it into Dallas once or twice a year. And it was always this big thing and very intimidating. And just to think, in my mind, this guy was like the long arm of the why is that so hard to say? Long arm of the law in Dallas, where like the people we're scared of in Dallas, we're scared of him, is kind of how I saw it. So then over time, at some point they told me that he had captured Lee Harvey Oswald, who shot JFK. And that didn't really resonate with me much. I was like, whoa, that's cool. But at the same time, they could have told me he caught a 46-pound catfish, and I would have been just as impressed, because it was hard to get a grasp of how big the country or the world is. The president was not much more impressive to me than the mayor of Granbury. So, over time, it took a while for it to really kick in, which is kind of the way it goes with things that you kind of know all your life. I think I was in about 7th grade the first time I started to figure out what a big deal this was. So 7th grade history class, I had a real history teacher, not a coach. This lifetime educator. I think he was close to retirement age, and he was pretty sick of 7th graders and teaching them history. And I was not a good student. And one day he started talking about different historical events that had happened in Texas, and he brought up JFK being assassinated. And I kind of raised my hand and I said, "Oh, Lee Harvey Oswald." And I think he was a little shocked, because it was probably the first time I raised my hand and said anything right all year. And he's like, oh yeah. And I was like, yeah, my uncle was the police officer that captured him. And he kind of gave me a weird look. And because, like I said, we all got uncles that got stories, and I'm sure that he probably didn't believe me. And so he kind of pulled me aside after class and was like, what's your uncle's name? And I was like, oh, it's Uncle Nick. He's like, oh, what's his last name? I don't know. Uncle. And so he apparently went and like looked it up, and then he came back the next day and was like, what'd you say your uncle's name was? And I said, Nick. And he was like, oh, I was looking and it said that a guy named Maurice captured him, Maurice McDonald. And I was like, oh. And so at that point, now I think that he's full of crap, that my uncle was, pulling my leg or something. So I go to my mom. I'm like relaying these messages back and forth between my history teacher and mother. And she's like, yeah, that's Uncle Nick. His name is Maurice in something that's, it's not Nicholas. It was like Maurice Neil McDonald, but he goes by Nick. And I was like, oh, it is Maurice. Okay. So I go back and I tell the teacher, it's like, yeah, his name is Maurice Neil Nick McDonald. And he was like, oh, wow. And so he was like really, really interested in this. So I think at that point, it hit me what a big deal this was. And I was starting to figure out just how huge the world was and what a big deal this was, and how many people really loved JFK, and how many people, how this like affected the whole country. So I really looked forward to seeing Uncle Nick again so I could ask him about it. And so the next time I saw him, doesn't seem like it was much long after that, I asked him to tell me the story. And it's funny because I think you see this a lot with athletes. Like if there's like a pro athlete that like had like some big play they did, like Roger Staubach with the Hail Mary, or, Nolan Ryan with his no-hitter or something. When you've got a big story, like lifetime career-defining story, you've told it a lot of times, and they become very well rehearsed. They become very polished stories. They're ones where they know what parts are going to like really pull you in, and what details to leave out, and what, really where the impact is. And it was one of the first times that I remember somebody telling me a story like that, where that was obviously the biggest thing that ever happened to him by a long shot. And so he told me the story, and it was awesome. So the way the story goes, first thing, I will paint some of my own perspective on this. My impression that I get of Nick as a police officer is he was not like a big deal. He was not like just this massive like rock star police officer kind of person. He was like a dude. He was a police officer, regular dude. He had a squad car, he had a partner, he had a beat. He probably had that little meeting in the morning where the sergeant gripes at everybody for not writing enough tickets or whatever. At this point, we're just dealing with stuff I've seen on TV that I'm projecting onto this, but that's okay. That was my impression of him, is that out of all the police officers in Dallas, he was one of them. And the day that JFK was coming in town, obviously this was like an all hands on deck kind of thing. So he had his little section of town he's going to be in, and he and his partner like driving around or whatever. And one of his best friends was Officer J.D. Tippit, who was not his partner, but they were in the same locker room. They talked all the time. And I believe the way the story went, they actually had either gone out to dinner the night before, or were going to go out to dinner that night. Like there's, some story along those lines. But so I guess Nick is like driving around, and then they get the call that, they hear over the radio that the president's been shot, or shots fired, and all this stuff, complete pandemonium. And I'm not sure if they were headed down there or if they're staying in their part of town. Whatever happened, it wasn't much longer after that they got a officer down kind of message went out, completely separate from JFK. And of course, all the cops want to know who was it. You know, and Dallas wasn't near as big as it is now, and those officers are gonna know each other, and they're all freaking out trying to figure out who it is, and they say it was J.D. Tippit, his friend. And so my understanding of the story is that Nick went down to the area where J.D. Tippit was shot, and his purpose was to catch the person who shot J.D. Tippit. And so he went down to where the Texas Theater was, and some shop owner down there had said that he saw a guy acting really squirrely come into his store, kind of stand there and kind of duck behind some stuff for a minute, and then he ran into the theater, and it said that he ran in without paying. So he, I remember reading that he waited there for some other backup to go in with him, and they go in to arrest this guy. So they go into the theater. I remember I believe it was playing a movie called War is Hell. It was like a double feature, and both of the movies had something to do with death and war and, you know, all this stuff. And they go into theater, and it is dark, and they see there's some people there. And basically they're looking for a person who got in without paying. And I think they didn't want to tip their hand too quick that they're after the guy that shot Tippit. So they kind of start going person by person and asking questions. Hey, do you pay for your ticket? Can I see your ticket? You know, but the whole time they're eyeballing Oswald over in the corner. They know exactly where he is. So Nick gets up to Oswald, and he's like, can I see your ticket? You know, stand up, you know, whatever. And Oswald said, it's over now, and acts like he's going to surrender. And when he does, he reaches for a pistol he has, which is the one he shot Tippit with, and it's a .38. And when he pulls it out, Nick punched him. And when Nick punched him, he took a step back, and he pulled the pistol out, and he pulled the trigger in Nick's gut, and Nick reaches for the gun, and what ends up happening is the hammer on the pistol comes down and lands here in this like webbing between his finger and thumb, and so the gun doesn't go off. And I guess a struggle ensues, and then Oswald hit him in the face with the pistol, and I think got him pretty good. And then all the other officers jump down and they arrest him and they drag him out of there. I think Nick was pretty injured there for a little bit, or at least dazed, because I know when they pulled Oswald out of the theater, he wasn't one of the officers that was taking him to arrest him. And so Nick, you know, there's pictures of, you know, Nick with this big scratch on his face from the pistol, and more importantly, when you look at the Lee Harvey Oswald mugshot, he's got a black eye, and my Uncle Nick gave that to him, which pretty cool. So after that, obviously, you know, everything else that happened, you know, Jack Ruby shoots Oswald and all that. The crazy thing after that was Nick somehow ended up being a person that was kind of put on duty to kind of hang out with Marina Oswald when they had her in custody. So not only did he arrest the husband, but he was now hanging out with Marina Oswald, and he actually got to know her really well. And he just had like all kinds of tentacles that had to do with this whole thing, because he even mentioned at one point he knew Jack Ruby, who shot Lee Harvey Oswald. He had crossed paths with them because he was kind of this wannabe cop that liked to be friends with the cops, and he liked to invite them to his club and give them free drinks and free food and whatever, because he was like a friend of the police. And so that was kind of the story. And from then on, after I heard the story, it started this kind of trend that I've seen over, that still goes on. It's like, it kind of gets forgotten, and then like an anniversary will come up, or some date, or someone says president says they're releasing JFK files. Every time JFK comes up, his name will end up coming up. And, so it gets kind of stirred up again. And I remember one of those anniversaries was when I was a senior in high school. There was a show called Top Cops. And I guess it was like a show where like a police officer would tell a story of some heroic thing they did. And it was like on network TV. And I guess it's back when just in general, people still seem to like police officers. There was like this show, and he came on there and told the story, and it was like awesome. And so I got to come to school and be like, yeah, that was my uncle. Everybody see him on CBS last night? Yeah, so yeah, that was that. So as I got older, my grandmother moved away. I think she moved to Arkansas to live next to her sister and Nick. And so they didn't really have a reason to come down and visit anymore because my grandmother wasn't there. And we just kind of lost touch. And I didn't see him for years. And he hadn't crossed my mind. And, I got older. And I think I was in my 20s, early 20s. And just randomly out of the blue, we got this envelope in the mail. And it was from Nick, and it was to me. And without any explanation, anything, it was just this packet of really cool stuff. And it was like a copy of JFK's death certificate. It was a copy of arrest report for Lee Harvey Oswald, another one for Jack Ruby. It was a typewritten story where he wrote the whole story of what happened to him, and it was like it was like the original one that he typed. It was an article that told his whole story, where he was on the cover of Parade magazine. It used to be put in the middle of the newspaper, on like the Sunday edition of the newspaper, and just all this stuff, and he like autographed all of it. And I guess it was his way of kind of reaching out and staying in touch. But I kept all that stuff, and you can see all this stuff's pretty cool. I think from that, it was interesting to read people's description of these things that happened. I noticed with Jack Ruby's arrest report, it had, each of his fingerprints, and one of them isn't there because he was missing a finger. I noticed his name wasn't Jack Ruby, it was like Rubenstein, and it was like, I guess back in the day in Dallas, you kind of weren't proud of being Jewish. It was like bad for business. Maybe some people didn't like Jews, so he went by Jack Ruby. So there were just a lot of little nuggets of interesting information out of that whole thing. I would say a few years after that, Nick got a book deal and he wrote a book. I think he had some kind of trouble with the publisher where they kept giving him the runaround about his book being published. And, it was sad that it turned out this way, but I actually found out that Nick passed away from like CNN.com. Just one day, there just popped up on the headlines that the officer that arrested, Oswald had passed away. And I was like, oh my God, it's Nick. And that was how I found out. I found out before, some of my family did. And so his book was eventually published, and it was really interesting. There was a lot of stuff still I didn't know. Had a lot of stuff about him, like testifying with the Warren Commission. And I think a lot of people are always curious, like, did he think there was like a conspiracy theory? Did he think that Oswald acted alone? Was it the Cubans or communists or the mob or LBJ or something, And he always was really, really adamant that he thought Oswald acted alone. Um, and I don't even think it's worth getting into my opinion on any of that, because I don't know why it's still such a hot button thing. But I know for sure that as a police officer, he did the job he was supposed to do. He's got a guy that they said did this. He goes in there to arrest the guy. He got his guy. He believed to the day he died that that was the guy. And you know, obviously there's just mountains and mountains of evidence to support that. So I'll just leave it at that. You know, I will say that conspiracy theories kind of fall apart for me when the amount of people who would have to be in on the conspiracy is just so massively huge. So I'll just say that much. But anyway, that's all I got. So, is there a moral to this story? You know, I think about people who go into positions of service, like a police officer or a fireman or EMT or something like that. You know, I feel like Nick was someone who was a pretty average person. You know, I think that he was just a guy, and he probably the day before that was getting a cat out of a tree, or like giving somebody a jaywalking ticket, you know, and he suddenly was just put into this position where he became part of like history. And I think that could really happen to anyone who is in one of those fields. So, you know, hats off to people who, you know, can step up when something like that arises. I know working in computer software, things like that really don't happen to me. So hats off to him, and, you know, God rest his soul.